The dust on Talvos 3 tasted like copper and regret. Neil Foster had grown used to both during his 8 months on this forgotten rock at the edge of human space. He crouched beside a thermal vent, watching steam rise in lazy spirals toward the twin moons barely visible in the afternoon sky. His scanner beeped rhythmically as it recorded temperature fluctuations, atmospheric composition, mineral content, all the data that headquarters wanted but nobody would ever read. That was fine with Neil. Reading required caring, and he had accepted this posting specifically because nobody cared about Talvos III. Nobody cared about him either, which made them a perfect match. The crystalline forest behind him chimed softly as wind moved through the mineral formations. After 8 months, he could almost distinguish between the different tones, the deep bells of the iron-rich crystals near his station, the higher tinkling of the silicon deposits closer to the mountains. It was prettier than the silence of his empty apartment back on Earth had been. Prettier than the echo of doors slamming during arguments he could not quite remember anymore. Neil checked his scanner again and frowned. The thermal output had dropped 3 degrees since yesterday. That was unusual. These vents were supposed to be stable, part of the planet's deep mantle system that had been running unchanged for millions of years. He made a note in his log, then stood and stretched. His knees popped. 32 years old and already falling apart. Something moved at the edge of his vision. Neil turned slowly, one hand dropping to the emergency beacon on his belt. Protocol said never approach unknown fauna. Protocol said maintain distance and observe. Protocol had a lot to say about staying safe and alive on frontier worlds where help was 3 weeks away at best. The creature that limped out from between 2 massive crystal formations was like nothing in his xenobiology database. It stood perhaps waist-high, built like someone had crossed a lizard with a dragon from old Earth mythology. 6 limbs, 4 for walking, 2 smaller ones tucked against its chest like arms. Wings folded against its back, membrane torn and bloody, scales that shifted color as it moved, deep violet flowing into copper, then back again like oil on water, and it was hurt. Neil could see the gash along its flank immediately, a wound that wept luminescent blue blood down its leg. The creature, a juvenile, he guessed from its proportions, was breathing hard, each exhale creating small puffs of vapor in the cooling afternoon air. Its eyes, though, those stopped him from running. They were prismatic, catching the light and breaking it into rainbows, and they held an intelligence that made his breath catch. The creature looked at him. Really looked, the way a person might assess a stranger in a dark alley. Neil raised both hands slowly, palms out. "Hey there," he said quietly, knowing it could not understand but hoping tone might carry meaning. "You are hurt pretty bad." The creature tilted its head, reminding Neil absurdly of a curious dog. It took a tentative step forward, then stopped when Neil remained still. Another step. Its injured leg buckled slightly and it made a sound, a soft pip noise that seemed too delicate for something with claws that could probably shred him. Protocol said, "Observe." Protocol said do not interfere with native fauna. Protocol said maintaining scientific objectivity was paramount. Neil had broken protocol the day he stopped caring about his marriage, his career trajectory, and whether anyone remembered his name. One more violation would not matter. He moved slowly toward his field kit, never taking his eyes off the creature. It watched him with what might have been wariness or might have been hope. He genuinely could not tell. He pulled out the universal coagulant, a broad-spectrum medical compound designed to work with most carbon-based biochemistry. Might work, might kill it faster. The xenobiology field was full of might and maybe. "Okay," Neil said softly, kneeling down to the creature's level. "This is probably going to sting." The creature did not run. Instead, it lowered itself to the ground in what looked like a conscious decision, making itself smaller, less threatening. Trusting. Neil approached carefully and applied the coagulant to the wound. The creature flinched but made no sound beyond a slight rumble deep in its chest. The blue blood stopped flowing almost immediately, the wound edges pulling together in a way that suggested accelerated healing. Neil wrapped it with synthetic bandage material, more to keep dirt out than anything else. When he finished, he sat back on his heels. The creature raised its head and looked at him for a long moment. Then it did something that would replay in Neil's mind for weeks afterward. It pressed the side of its snout against his open palm, warm scales against his skin. and that rumbling sound came again. Deeper this time, almost like a cat's purr if the cat weighed 60 kilos and had wings. They stayed like that for perhaps 30 seconds before the creature pulled away. It stood carefully, testing its injured leg. Satisfied, it looked at Neil one more time, then turned and limped away into the crystal forest. Within moments, it had vanished among the mineral formations, leaving only a few spots of luminescent blue blood on the dusty ground. Neil sat there as the twin moons rose higher, and the temperature began to drop. He should report this. He should document everything. He should at least take a blood sample for analysis. Instead, he opened his log and typed, Day 243, observed medium-sized fauna near thermal vent cluster 7. Subject exhibited standard cautious behavior around human presence. No aggressive tendencies noted. Atmospheric readings continue normal. He saved the log and closed his datapad. Then he gathered his equipment and walked back toward his station, trying not to think about prismatic eyes that held understanding, or the warmth of trust pressed against his palm, or how long it had been since anything living had looked at him like he mattered. 14 days of routine passed before Neil found the gift. He stumbled over it literally, his boot connecting with something solid as he stepped out of his station at dawn. He looked down and found a crystal formation unlike any he had catalogued. Before, perfectly geometric, about the size of his fist, glowing faintly with internal light that pulsed like a heartbeat. Neil picked it up carefully. The crystal was warm to the touch and hummed when he moved it, producing a low harmonic that made his teeth ache pleasantly. He turned in a slow circle, scanning the area around his station, but saw nothing moving in the pre-dawn darkness except the eternal shimmer of the crystal forest. He brought the formation inside and set it on his workbench. When he powered up his scanning equipment, the readings went haywire, electromagnetic interference spiking across multiple frequencies. The crystal was not just humming, it was singing, producing sound waves that his equipment could barely register, but that he could feel in his bones. Neil thought about the creature he had helped 2 weeks ago, about intelligent eyes and deliberate trust, about a gesture that might have been gratitude. He went back outside and looked at the dusty ground near where he had found the crystal. There, barely visible in the dim light, were tracks, 6-limbed tracks, leading away from his door toward the forest. Pip, Neil said aloud, remembering that soft sound the creature had made. The name felt right somehow. That evening, after another day of routine work that meant nothing to anyone, Neil synthesized a batch of nutrient paste based on what he remembered of the creature's blood chemistry. He had taken scans even if he had not taken samples, force of habit from years of training. The paste probably tasted terrible, but it should be digestible and nutritious for carbon-based biology with a crystalline mineral supplement requirement. Probably. He left it in a shallow dish outside his door before bed. Dawn came. The dish was empty. In its place sat 3 stones worn perfectly smooth, arranged in a triangle. A pattern started. Every few days, Pip would visit at hours when Neil was away from the station, leaving gifts, crystals, stones, strange seed pods, a piece of shell that glowed under UV light. Neil left food, experimenting with different formulations until he found one that Pip seemed to prefer, judging by how quickly the dishes emptied. On day 23 after the first encounter, Pip finally appeared while Neil was present. Neil was outside repairing a solar collector when he heard that familiar Pip sound. He turned slowly and found the creature perched on a boulder 20 meters away, watching him. "Hello again," Neil said, setting down his tools. Pip made a chittering noise and tilted his head. The wound Neil had treated was healed completely, leaving only a slight difference in scale coloration to mark where it had been. The creature looked healthier overall. Scales brighter, wings properly folded, eyes alert and curious. Neil sat down cross-legged in the dust, making himself less threatening. Pip watched this with apparent interest, then hopped down from the boulder. He approached cautiously, circling Neil at a distance before gradually spiraling closer. When he was within arm's reach, he stopped and made that purring rumble. "You are looking good," Neil told him. "Healing well?" Pip tilted his head the other way, then did something new. He raised one of those small front limbs and touched his own chest, made a sound, a complex trill. Then he pointed that limb at Neil and made a questioning chirp. Neil stared. "Are you asking my name?" The pointing gesture came again, more insistent. "Neil," he said, touching his own chest. "I am Neil." Pip's eyes literally brightened, the prismatic surfaces catching more light. He made an approximation of the sound. Neil. That was close enough to make Neil laugh with delight. Then, Pip touched his own chest again and made that complex trill, slower this time, like he was teaching. Over the following weeks, a strange vocabulary developed between them. Neil learned that Pip's trill name was unpronounceable for human vocal cords, so the nickname stuck. Pip learned to recognize dozens of human words, though he could only approximate a few. But language was only part of it. They communicated through gesture, through posture, through shared activities. Pip would arrive and Neil would stop working to sit with him. Sometimes they would explore nearby areas together, Pip leading Neil to thermal vents or crystal formations he had never catalogued. Sometimes they would simply exist in the same space, Pip sunning himself on warm rocks while Neil read reports on his data pad. It was during one of these quiet moments that Neil admitted to himself he had been lonely, desperately, achingly lonely in a way he had not let himself acknowledge. And now he was not, because a six-limbed dragon the size of a large dog had decided a human was worth knowing. He researched Pip's species in the colony database during long evenings. Information was sparse. The species was called Dracosyn by the few traders who had encountered them on distant worlds. They were ancient, elusive, possibly sapient, though no formal contact had ever been established. Rumors suggested complex social structures, long memories, and a tendency to avoid other species entirely, which made Pip's repeated visits even more remarkable. On day 67, Dr. Okoye's face appeared on Neil's screen during the weekly check-in. She was a stern woman in her 50s who ran the xenobiology division with precise efficiency. "Your supply requisitions are unusual, Foster." Neil kept his expression neutral. "How so?" "You are using 3 times the standard medical supplies for a solo posting, and your food synthesizer logs show production of nutrient profiles that do not match human requirements." Her eyes were sharp behind her glasses. "Care to explain?" "Testing various supplements," Neil said smoothly. "The mineral content in the water here is affecting my digestion. I have been experimenting with dietary adjustments." It was not entirely a lie. The water did have high mineral content. He just was not the one with digestion issues. Dr. Okoye studied him for a long moment. "You look healthier than when you arrived," she finally said. "Less like a man trying to disappear. Whatever you're doing, keep it up. But file proper reports on those dietary experiments. We need documentation." "Yes, ma'am." The screen went dark. Neil exhaled slowly. That had been close. He could not hide Pip forever, but he was not ready to share this strange friendship with people who would turn it into data points and policy debates. That evening, Pip arrived just after sunset. But something was wrong. The creature was agitated, circling the station repeatedly, making distressed calls that echoed across the valley. His scales flickered through colors rapidly, violet to copper to a deep red Neil had never seen before. "What is wrong?" Neil asked, following Pip outside. "What happened?" Pip launched himself into the air, those wings that had seemed too small now carrying him upward in strong beats. He circled once, twice, calling to Neil. Then he vanished into the darkness, heading toward the mountains where the crystal forest grew thickest. Neil stood alone in the dust, watching the empty sky, and felt the cold wind of approaching night settle into his bones. 3 weeks stretched into an eternity measured by empty food dishes and silent mornings. Neil extended his survey routes far beyond protocol limits, pushing deeper into the crystal forest than any human had documented. He told himself he was conducting research, expanding the geographical database, fulfilling his mandate as a xenobiologist. The truth sat heavier in his chest with each passing day. He was searching for a friend who had vanished. The forest changed as he traveled further from his station. The crystals grew taller, some reaching 15 meters high, their surfaces etched with patterns that might have been natural or might have been carved by intelligent hands centuries ago. The air grew warmer here, rich with sulfur and mineral tang. Thermal vents dotted the landscape like breathing holes in the planet's skin. On day 19 of Pip's absence, Neil found the battlefield. The crystals in this area were shattered, great formations reduced to glittering dust that crunched under his boots. Scorch marks blackened the ground in long streaks, as if something incredibly hot had been dragged across stone. The air smelled of ozone and burnt metal. Neil knelt beside a cluster of scales scattered among the debris. Some were red, others a deep green he had never seen on Pip. But there, half buried in crystal dust, was a scale-colored copper violet. He picked it up with shaking hands. It was warm. "Recently shed, Pip," he whispered to the empty air. His datapad chimed. Dr. Okoye's scheduled check-in. Neil considered ignoring it, then reluctantly accepted the call. Her face appeared on the screen, concern etched in the lines around her eyes. "Foster, your psych metrics are concerning," she said without preamble. "Your sleep patterns are erratic. Your caloric intake has dropped, and you have filed reports from locations that require dangerous solo travel. I am recommending a fitness evaluation and possible early rotation back to the main colony." "I am fine," Neil said, hearing how hollow his voice sounded. "You are not fine. You look like you have lost a family member." Dr. Okoye leaned closer to her camera. "What is happening out there, Neil? Talk to me." For a moment he almost told her everything, almost explained about the lonely creature who had trusted him, about the gifts and the shared moments and how something non-human had reminded him what connection felt like. But she would recall him immediately. She would send a team to study Pip. They would turn friendship into a case study. "Just missing Earth," he lied. "You know, the usual." Dr. Okoye did not look convinced, but she nodded slowly. "Take care of yourself, Foster." "That is an order. Check in again in 3 days, and I want to see improvement." The screen went dark. Neil stood in the center of the destruction and tried to imagine what had happened here. A fight, clearly. Pip against larger members of his own species, or perhaps something else entirely. But why territory? Resources? Or was it about him? About a young Dracosan breaking some taboo by befriending a human? He searched the area for hours, finding more scales, more evidence of combat, but no bodies. That was good, he told himself. That meant everyone had survived. That meant Pip might still be out there somewhere. As twin moons rose and the temperature dropped, Neil made his way back toward his station. The crystal forest sang its evening song, but it sounded mournful now, like the world itself was grieving. He was halfway home when he saw the shape flying overhead. Large, much larger than Pip, with wings that stretched 4 meters at least. Scales the color of fresh blood caught the moonlight as it passed. Neil froze, pressing himself against a crystal formation, barely breathing. The creature circled once high above, then descended. It landed 50 meters from Neil's position with surprising grace for something that large. Up close, Neil could see the muscle definition, the scars, the way this Dracosan held itself with absolute confidence. This was an adult, a warrior, something that could kill him without effort. The creature's head swung in his direction, eyes like molten gold fixed on him. Neil felt the weight of that gaze, felt himself being evaluated and judged. He raised his hands slowly, showing he was unarmed, though what good that would do against something that size he had no idea. They stared at each other for a long moment. Then the red Dracosan made a sound, not a trill or a pip, but a deep resonant note that Neil felt in his chest. It was not aggressive exactly, more like a statement, a warning, or perhaps a message he had no way of understanding. The creature spread its wings and launched itself skyward with a downdraft that nearly knocked Neil over. Within seconds it had vanished into the night. Neil stood shaking in the darkness. That had been a test, he was certain. He had been found, observed, and allowed to live. But why? What did the larger Dracosan want? And where was Pip? He made it back to his station well after midnight, exhausted physically and emotionally. He heated a ration pack he did not want and sat staring at the empty dish outside his door, the dish Pip had not eaten from in 3 weeks. His datapad chimed with a personal message. From his ex-wife, the first contact in 8 months. He deleted it without reading. Whatever she had to say could not matter less than the silence outside his door. Neil opened his personal log, not the official one, and began to type. I came to this planet to disappear, to stop caring about anything or anyone. And then an injured creature taught me that caring is what makes us human, that connection matters, That even across species and worlds and impossible distances, friendship can bloom in the most unlikely places. And now I think I have lost that connection. And the weight of that loss is crushing me in ways my divorce never did. Because Pip chose to trust me, and I could not protect him from whatever consequences that trust brought. He saved the log and sat in the darkness, listening to the wind and hoping for a sound that did not come. Dawn arrived cold and colorless. Neil dragged himself outside to begin another day of pointless work. He was halfway to the nearest thermal vent cluster when he heard it. Pip, soft, distant, but unmistakable. Neil spun around, scanning the crystal forest, his heart hammering. There. Movement between two large formations. A shape that was the right size, the right proportions. Pip? He called, his voice cracking. The shape emerged into the open and Neil's breath caught. It was Pip, but changed. The Dragonling had grown, filling out with muscle, wings now fully developed and proportionate to his body. New scars crossed his scales like silver threads. He looked older, harder, like someone who had been to war and survived. But his eyes, those prismatic eyes, were the same. And they were fixed on Neil with an expression that might have been relief. Pip approached slowly, as if unsure of his welcome. As if the weeks apart might have severed what they had built together. Neil dropped to his knees in the dust and held out his hand. Pip closed the distance and pressed his scaled head against Neil's palm, and that rumbling purr filled the morning air. Pip would not come inside the station. That was the first sign something had changed. He circled the structure repeatedly, making sounds Neil had never heard before. Clicks and warbles that carried urgency. Every few minutes he would pause and look at Neil expectantly, then return to his restless movement. "What is it?" Neil asked, following Pip outside for the third time. "What are you trying to tell me?" Pip stopped and stared at him for a long moment. Then deliberately, he began scratching marks in the dust with one of his smaller front limbs. Neil watched, fascinated, as shapes emerged. Crude but intentional. Not random, purposeful. The first shape was circular with smaller circles around it. Could be a planet. Could be the sun with orbits. Pip tapped it twice with his claw, then drew another shape, rectangular with a tiny figure inside. The figure had 2 legs, 2 arms. "Human. That is me," Neil said slowly. "You drew me." Pip's scales flickered brighter. He made an encouraging chirp and drew more. Multiple 6-limbed figures arranged in a cluster. Then a line from the cluster to the human figure, then something that might have been a question mark, if question marks existed in alien pictogram language. Neil knelt beside the drawings, studying them. "Your people. You are asking about your people and me?" Pip nodded, actually nodded, a gesture he must have learned from watching Neil. He scratched out more images. A thermal vent recognizable by its spiral shape. But he drew a line through it, then drew multiple 6-limbed figures lying down. Still. Not moving. Neil's stomach dropped. "Your people are sick, dying?" Pip made a distressed sound and began drawing frantically. More vents with lines through them. More prone figures. Then he drew the human figure again and circled it several times. Pointed at Neil. Pointed at the drawings. Pointed toward the mountains. Understanding crashed over Neil like cold water. "You want me to help them. Your people need help, and you want me to come with you." Pip touched his snout to Neil's hand, their gesture of trust and agreement. Neil sat back on his heels, mind racing. This was beyond every protocol, every regulation, every boundary his job had established. He was supposed to observe, not interfere, study, not interact, document, not get involved in alien crises. If he did this, his career was over. Dr. Okoye would recall him. He might face sanctions, penalties, maybe even criminal charges depending on how badly things went. But Pip was looking at him with those prismatic eyes full of desperate hope, and Neil remembered being alone and broken. Remembered a wounded creature trusting him when trust should have been impossible. He pulled out his datapad and found Dr. Okoye's contact. Her face appeared on the screen, already frowning. "Foster, your check-in is not scheduled for another 12 hours. I need to report a first contact situation," Neil said quickly. "Indigenous sapient species, Dracosian. One individual has established communication protocols with me and is requesting assistance for his people. They are experiencing a crisis related to failing thermal systems in their nesting grounds." Dr. Okoye's expression shifted from annoyance to shock to something that might have been fury. You have been in contact with a sapient species for months and did not report it? Correct. Foster, do you understand the regulations you have violated? The protocols you have ignored? I am going with him, Neil interrupted. To their nesting grounds. They need help, and I am the only human they trust. You can recall me afterward, file whatever charges you want, but I am doing this. You absolutely are not. I am ordering you to remain at your station. A proper diplomatic team will take 3 weeks to arrive, and by then whatever is killing them might have finished the job. Neil kept his voice level. You trained me to recognize sapient behavior, Dr. Okoye. Tool use, communication, abstract reasoning, empathy. Pip demonstrates all of it. His people are dying, and I can help, so I am going. I will keep my data pad active and transmit everything I see. You will have documentation, but I am going. Dr. Okoye stared at him through the screen. If you do this, your career is finished. I know. You could be killed. I know that too. A long silence stretched between them. Finally, Dr. Okoye's expression softened slightly. Send me everything. Every detail. If you die out there, Foster, I will kill you myself. The screen went dark. Neil looked at Pip, who had been watching this exchange with clear interest despite not understanding the words. Okay, show me. Pip made a joyful trill and immediately set off toward the mountains at a pace that forced Neil to jog. They traveled for hours, climbing higher into terrain Neil had never mapped. The air grew warmer despite the altitude, thick with sulfur and something else, something organic and faintly sweet that made him think of decay. Other Dracosin appeared as they traveled deeper. They shadowed Pip and Neil from a distance, never approaching but never leaving. Neil counted at least 6 distinct individuals, all larger than Pip, all watching with those unsettling, intelligent eyes. He kept his hands visible and his movements slow, trying to project non-threat. The sun was setting when they reached the entrance to a vast canyon system. Pip paused at the edge, made a complex series of sounds, and 3 adult Dracocene emerged from the shadows. They were massive, twice Pip's size, with scales in shades of blue and green that seemed to absorb light. One of them approached Pip and made a rumbling sound. They touched snouts briefly, a gesture that seemed intimate, familial. Pip responded with chirps and trills, occasionally gesturing toward Neil. The adults listened, their attention fixed on the human standing at the canyon's edge. Neil felt the weight of their scrutiny like physical pressure. Finally, the largest of the 3, blue scales marked with white patterns that might have been age or rank, approached Neil directly. It stopped 3 meters away and studied him for a long, tense moment. Then it lowered its head slightly and made a sound that was somehow both a question and a greeting. Neil mimicked the gesture, bowing his head, hoping he was not accidentally declaring war or proposing marriage or something equally catastrophic. The blue Dracocean's eyes brightened. It made a satisfied sound and turned, walking into the canyon. Pip nudged Neil's leg and gestured to follow. They descended into the earth. The temperature climbed with every meter, until Neil was sweating heavily despite his cooling vest. The canyon walls glowed with bioluminescent growths, casting everything in shades of green and blue. The path twisted and turned, revealing chambers filled with crystal formations that hummed with that same harmonic frequency he had found in Pip's first gift. Then they emerged into the nesting grounds, and Neil forgot how to breathe. The valley was enormous, a geological wonder of terraced platforms surrounding active thermal vents. Dozens of Dracocin moved among the formations, adults, juveniles, and shapes that were clearly eggs arranged in heated sand beds. But Dr. Okoye was right about one thing. This was a species in crisis. Many of the vents were dark, their openings cold and silent. The sand beds near them held eggs that looked dull, lifeless. Several juveniles lay motionless on rocks that should have been warm. Their scales faded, their breathing labored. Adult Dracocin moved among them with a weariness that transcended language. And at the center of it all, watching Neil's arrival with eyes like molten gold, was the largest Dracocin he had ever seen. Her scales were copper gold, marked with scars that spoke of age and battles survived. She was easily 4 times Pip's size, and she radiated authority like heat from a forge. Pip approached her and lowered himself to the ground in clear submission. He made a series of sounds, then gestured toward Neil. The matriarch's gaze shifted to the human standing in her dying home, and Neil understood with absolute certainty that his life hung in the balance of whatever judgment she was forming. The matriarch moved like water despite her size, flowing across the warm stone toward Neil with a grace that seemed impossible. Every Dracosin in the valley had stopped to watch this meeting. Neil could feel the weight of dozens of prismatic eyes tracking his smallest movement. He held his ground through sheer force of will. Running would accomplish nothing except confirming he was prey. Instead, he slowly lowered himself to one knee, not quite prostrating himself but showing respect. Acknowledging her authority in her own domain, the matriarch stopped 2 meters away. Up close, Neil could see the fine details of her scales, the way each one overlapped the next in patterns that suggested both armor and art. Her breath smelled of minerals and heat. When she exhaled, the air shimmered. She tilted her head, studying him with an intensity that made him feel transparent. Then she made a sound, deep, resonant, complex. Not a question. A test. Neil pulled out his datapad slowly, making sure she could see every movement. He opened the visual language he had developed with Pip, simple symbols representing concepts they had managed to communicate. He showed her the images of thermal vents, of heating and cooling, of systems that should work but did not. The matriarch's eyes brightened fractionally. She leaned closer to the datapad, examining the symbols. Then she made a sharp gesture with one of her smaller limbs, the same questioning gesture Pip had used weeks ago. Over the next hour, they developed a crude conversation. Neil used his datapad to show geological surveys, data on thermal systems, diagrams of underground tectonic activity. The matriarch watched everything, occasionally making sounds that Pip would then translate through gesture and drawing. What Neil learned made his blood run cold. The nesting grounds had been stable for generations beyond counting. The thermal vents were not just heat sources, they were life itself for the Dracosin. Their eggs required specific temperatures to develop. Their young needed warmth to grow properly. Even the adults suffered without the thermal radiation, growing sluggish and sick. 3 months ago, the vents had begun to fail. Not all at once, but gradually, like a disease spreading through the earth. The Dracosin had tried everything their ancient knowledge could offer, clearing blockages, opening new channels, moving eggs to the still functioning vents. Nothing worked. Neil pulled up his geological scans of the region. His hands shook slightly as he processed the data, but the conclusion was clear. A tectonic shift had occurred deep beneath the surface, probably triggered by seismic activity he had been too distracted to notice. The shift had closed off major thermal channels, redirecting the heat flow away from the nesting grounds. He showed the matriarch his analysis. Her reaction was not what he expected. Her scales darkened slightly, but she did not seem surprised. She had known, or at least suspected. What she had not known was whether anything could be done about it. Neil highlighted a section of his scan, a narrow point where the blockage was most severe. Seismic charges, he said, knowing she could not understand the words but hoping his tone carried meaning. He mimed an explosion with his hands, then showed data projections of heat flow resuming. The matriarch watched this demonstration with absolute focus. When he finished, she made a long, complicated sound that was probably a question, but might have been a judgment or possibly a threat. Pip translated with gestures. How can this happen? What will it cost? Can humans be trusted? That last question hung in the warm air like smoke. Neil thought about how to answer, then slowly set down his datapad. He reached into his field kit and pulled out the medical supplies he still carried, the same universal coagulant he had used on Pip months ago. He held it up, then pointed at the matriarch's visible scars, ancient wounds long healed but clearly significant. Then he pointed at Pip and mimed treating the wound. Mimed Pip returning. Mimed the gifts and the friendship and the trust that had grown between species that should have remained strangers. The matriarch stared at him for a long moment. Then she did something that made every other Dracosin in the valley go absolutely still. She lowered her head and touched her forehead to Neil's chest, just for a moment. A gesture of respect or acknowledgement or perhaps hope. When she pulled back, her scales had brightened slightly. She made a commanding sound that sent other Dracosin moving. Pip nudged Neil and gestured for him to follow. They spent the rest of the evening in what Neil could only describe as diplomatic observation. The matriarch led him through the nesting grounds, showing him everything. The cold vents, the struggling young, the eggs that would not hatch without proper heat. She was making sure he understood the stakes. This was not an academic problem or a research opportunity. This was survival. Neil documented everything on his datapad, sending continuous feeds back to Dr. Okoye. He could imagine her watching this unfold, probably surrounded by other scientists and administrators, everyone arguing about protocols and procedures while he walked among an alien species nobody had ever properly contacted. As night fell and the temperature in the valley dropped, the matriarch brought Neil to a sheltered alcove. Several younger Dracosin were there, including one who was clearly sick, scales dull, breathing labored, movements weak. Pip approached this individual carefully, making soft, encouraging sounds. The matriarch made a gesture toward Neil, then toward the sick juvenile. The meaning was clear: save him. Prove what you can do. Neil knelt beside the juvenile, who was too weak to be afraid of him. He pulled out his medical scanner and ran diagnostics. The reading showed extreme thermal dysregulation. The creature's metabolism was shutting down from lack of environmental heat. Its internal temperature was dropping despite the warm air, like a machine running out of fuel. There was nothing Neil could do medically. The juvenile did not need medicine. It needed heat that was no longer there. Neil looked at the matriarch and shook his head slowly. I cannot fix this. Not without fixing the vents. I am sorry. The matriarch's scales darkened further, but she made no aggressive move. She had not expected miracles. She had expected honesty. Neil realized with a start that this had been another test, not of his ability but of his character. Would he claim powers he did not have? Would he lie to gain favor? Instead, he pulled out his thermal blanket, a piece of emergency gear that could generate heat from a small battery pack. It would last maybe 8 hours before depleting. He wrapped it around the juvenile, who made a weak sound of relief as warmth surrounded him. It was a temporary measure, a band-aid on a mortal wound, but the matriarch's eyes brightened as she watched, and Neil understood he had given the right answer. Not false hope, just compassion in the face of suffering. Pip settled down beside the warming juvenile, and Neil sat with them both, feeling the weight of what he had agreed to attempt. Tomorrow he would need to convince his own people to help. Tomorrow he would need to somehow bridge two species that had no reason to trust each other. But tonight, he sat with Pip in an alien nesting ground, surrounded by a dying species that had chosen to trust a human, and felt the responsibility of that trust like a physical weight on his shoulders. The matriarch remained at the entrance to the alcove, watching over all of them. Guardian of her people, keeper of ancient traditions, and now perhaps someone willing to break those traditions if it meant survival. Neil opened a message to Dr. Okoye. I need seismic charges and the authorization to use them. I need engineers who understand tectonic systems. And I need them fast. People are dying here and we can stop it, please. He sent the message and waited, hoping that human compassion could move as fast as bureaucratic caution. The response came faster than Neil expected. 12 hours after his message, the whine of transport engines echoed across the valley. The Dracosin reacted immediately, adults positioning themselves between the sound and the eggs, juveniles, taking cover, the matriarch rising to her full height with scales darkening to deep bronze. Neil ran to the valley entrance, Pip close behind him. They are here to help, he said, though he was not entirely sure that was true yet. Please, let me talk to them first. The matriarch made a sharp sound, permission or warning Neil could not tell. He climbed to the canyon rim and watched 3 transport craft settle onto the dusty plain. The ramps dropped, and Neil's stomach sank as he saw what emerged. Dr. Okoye led the group, datapad in hand, but behind her came people Neil had not requested. Diplomats in formal attire looking absurdly out of place, scientists with scanning equipment already active, engineers carrying equipment cases, and most concerning, military personnel in light armor, weapons visible on their belts. Commander. Willis stepped forward, a career officer with gray at his temples and eyes that calculated threat assessments automatically. Dr. Foster, you have been busy. Commander, Dr. Okoye. Neil kept his voice level. Thank you for coming. The Dracosian matriarch has agreed to meet with us, but your personnel need to leave weapons at the transport. They are scared enough without adding visible threats. Negative, Willis said immediately. We are entering an unknown situation with an uncontacted species. My people stay armed for everyone's safety. Then they stay here, because if you walk into that valley with weapons, you will start a war neither side wants. Neil looked at Dr. Okoye. You saw my transmissions. You know what is at stake. Dr. Okoye studied him for a moment, then turned to Willis. Leave the weapons. That is not a request, Commander. Willis's jaw tightened, but after a moment he nodded to his personnel. They secured their weapons in the transport, though Neil noticed they kept their armor. It would have to be enough. The delegation descended into the canyon with Neil leading. He could feel the tension radiating from both groups, the humans nervous and uncertain, the Dracosin watching from shadows and high perches. Every movement felt fragile, like the wrong gesture could shatter this moment beyond repair. The matriarch waited at the valley center, flanked by 4 of her largest warriors. She had positioned herself deliberately, protecting the eggs and the sick, while presenting a clear show of strength. When the humans emerged into view, she made a low rumbling sound that echoed off the canyon walls. Willis's hand moved instinctively toward where his weapon should have been. Dr. Okoye grabbed his arm. Easy. That is not aggression. How do you... No, because we are still alive to hear it, Neil said quietly. He stepped forward, moving into the open space between the two groups. Pip emerged from the shadows to join him, creating a living bridge. Neil began the same visual communication he had established the previous night, using his datapad to show geological data. Dr. Okoye moved forward to see, and gradually the other scientists joined. They asked questions through Neil, who translated as best he could using the crude pictogram system. The engineers examined his surveys and nodded among themselves. This is doable, one of them said, a woman named Dr. Patterson, who had spent 20 years managing tectonic systems on frontier worlds. 3 seismic charges placed here, here, and here should clear the blockage and restore thermal flow. Standard procedure for geological reclamation. Standard procedure costs resources, Willis interjected. We need to discuss compensation. Access rights to the thermal vents for human research. Mining rights for the crystal formations. A formal treaty establishing... No. Neil cut him off sharply. Absolutely not. Willis turned to face him fully. Excuse me? You heard me. No conditions, no compensation, no treaty requiring them to give up anything. Neil felt anger building in his chest, hot and righteous. Their children are dying, Commander. This is not a negotiation. This is not politics. We help because we can, because it is the right thing to do, because when you have the power to save lives, you use it. That is not how interspecies relations work, Foster. There are procedures, protocols, then the procedures are wrong. Neil's voice rose and he saw the Dracosine watching this exchange with clear interest, despite not understanding the words. I came to this planet broken and alone. A creature I had never seen before approached me injured and afraid, and I helped him. Not because I expected something in return, not because I wanted to study him or use him. I helped him because he was hurt, and I could stop the hurting. He came back because kindness deserves loyalty, because compassion creates connection, because that is what we are supposed to be as humans, the species that helps. He turned to address Dr. Okoye and the scientists, the diplomats, everyone. The Dracosine have been here for thousands of years, maybe longer. They have survived disasters we cannot imagine, and now they need help, and they have chosen to trust us. A species that is hidden from all others has revealed their dying children to strangers because one of them learned that one human could be trusted. And your response is to demand payment? Silence fell across the valley. Even the Dracosine had gone still, as if sensing the significance of this moment. Dr. Okoye stepped forward. He is right. Her voice was quiet but firm. We are better than this. We have to be better than this. She looked at Willis. We provide the charges and the expertise. No conditions, no demands. We save lives because that is what we do. And if the administrators disagree, Willis challenged, then I will spend the rest of my career fighting them in every hearing and inquiry they want to hold. Dr. Okoye's expression was steel. "I will drag this into every news feed and public forum until everyone knows that Colonial Command chose politics over saving an intelligent species. So decide now, Commander. Do you want to be remembered as the man who helped First Contact succeed or the one who let children die for mineral rights?" Willis stared at her, then at Neil, then at the Dracocean watching from around the valley, at the eggs lying cold in their sand beds, at the matriarch standing guard over her dying people with a dignity that transcended species. "Get the charges," he finally said to his engineers. "Let us fix this." The next hours became a strange dance of cooperation. The engineers worked with Pip and several adult Dracocean to identify the optimal placement points. The Dracocean proved surprisingly adept at understanding the technical requirements, using their intimate knowledge of the tunnel systems to guide the humans to precise locations. Neil served as constant translator, his datapad displaying an ever-expanding vocabulary of shared concepts. The matriarch watched everything with those golden eyes, occasionally intervening to grant access to restricted areas or command her people to assist. As they worked, something remarkable happened. The initial tension began to ease. A human engineer showed a juvenile Dracocean how the seismic charges worked. A scientist shared water with an adult who had been guiding them through tight passages. Pip and several young Dracocean took to playfully racing with some of the younger human crew members during rest breaks. Dr. Okoye stood beside Neil at one point, watching this unfold. "You did this," she said quietly. "You built a bridge between species." "Pip built it," Neil corrected. "He chose trust when he had every reason to fear. I just tried to be worthy of that trust." By evening, the charges were placed. Dr. Patterson triple-checked the calculations, then looked at Neil. "You should ask permission. This is their home." Neil approached the matriarch with Pip beside him. Using the visual language, he showed her what would happen: a controlled detonation deep underground, possibly felt as vibrations throughout the valley. Temporary disruption. Then restored heat flow. The matriarch studied the display for a long moment. Then she made a commanding sound, and every Dracocean in the valley moved to shelter areas, taking the eggs with them. She looked at Neil and made a gesture he recognized, the same one Pip had used to indicate agreement. The detonation was surprisingly subtle, a distant rumble, a slight tremor underfoot. Then silence. For 30 seconds, nothing happened. Neil held his breath, wondering if they had failed. Then the first vent roared back to life, a gout of steam and heat erupting from the earth. Then another. Then another. Within minutes, the valley was warm again, the air thick with the sulfur and mineral scent that meant life to the Dracocean. The matriarch lifted her head and made a sound that was pure joy, a ringing call that every other Dracocean answered. The valley filled with harmonics, their voices blending into something that sounded like music, like celebration, like relief after endless fear. Eggs that had been dull began to glow with internal warmth. Juveniles stirred, their scales brightening. The sick juvenile Neil had wrapped in his thermal blanket, lifted its head and made a healthy chirping sound. The matriarch approached Neil slowly. She lowered her great head until her forehead touched his chest, the gesture of deep respect she had shown once before. But this time, when she pulled back, she did something new. She pressed one of her smaller front limbs against her own chest, then against Neil's. Then she made a sound, complex, beautiful, and filled with meaning Neil felt in his bones, even if he could not define it. Pip translated through gesture and sound. A name. She had given Neil a name in the Dracocean language. Denashka, one who walks between. Tears blurred Neil's vision. He bowed deeply to the matriarch, who returned the gesture with grave dignity. Over the following weeks, a permanent arrangement took shape. The human colony established a research station at a respectful distance from the nesting grounds. The Dracocean allowed limited scientific observation in exchange for continued thermal system monitoring. But more than that, they began to share. Knowledge, culture, stories told in pictures and sounds and gestures. Pip became the official liaison, a role that suited his curious nature. He divided his time between the nesting grounds and Neil's station. becoming fluent in the hybrid communication system they had developed. Other young Dracosian joined him, eager to learn about the strange two-legged creatures who had saved their species. 6 months after that first diplomatic meeting, Neil stood on a ridge overlooking both the human research station and the Dracosian Valley. Pip settled beside him, now fully adult, his scales shining in the light of the twin moons. "You know," Neil said quietly, "I came here to disappear, to stop feeling anything, and then you showed up injured and afraid and reminded me what matters." Pip made a soft purring sound and pressed his head against Neil's shoulder. "Thank you," Neil continued, "for choosing to trust, for teaching your people that humans could be friends, for showing me that connection is possible even when everything feels impossible." Pip pulled back and made a complex sound, then gestured at both settlements. His meaning was clear. Together. Family. Future. Neil smiled and looked out over the valley where Dracosian young played near warm vents, where human children from the colony came to learn about their alien neighbors, where two species that had no reason to trust each other were building something new. He had come to Talvos III broken and alone. A wandering Dragonling had found him and changed everything, not just for them but for their entire species. Because sometimes the smallest act of compassion, one injured creature helped by one lonely human, could bridge entire worlds and prove that hope was never as lost as it seemed.